Good morning. I'm Van Rogerson, president of NC East Alliance, and I'd like to welcome you to our Offshore Wind webinar. This is the first of a three-part series. Today, we're going to get an update on where things stand with North Carolina and Virginia officials. The upcoming next series parts will be infrastructure, supply chain. We'll talk about that at the end of the webinar. I want to give a special thank you to Joe Hines with Timmons. He's your moderator today. But Joe and Matt Smith with Hampton Roads Alliance has been working closely with Trey on this series. So thank you guys for that. And just briefly, I would like to thank our webinar sponsors, our advocacy sponsors that help us on issues around the region. Platinum, East Carolina University, Integrated Financial Holdings, Vidant Health, which is rebranding to ECU Health. Gold is Bulling Company, Dominion Energy, Electric Cities of North Carolina. A little shout out to Brenda Daniels, who's been a lifelong friend of ours in economic development, who's retiring next month. Kilpatrick Townsend Attorneys, Silver, Edenton Chowan Partnership, Evolve, PNC Bank, Martin Marietta, Nutrien, the Port of Virginia, and Martin County EDC. Thank you to all those sponsors. Now I'm going to turn it over to Trey, who's going over the Zoom meeting rules.
Thank you, Van. And as always, we'll quickly run through the Zoom rules for today. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentations today. So if you have any questions, please wait till the end to ask your question. You can click that Q&A box, type in your question and submit it. And if you'd like to, you can also ask a question live by clicking that raise hand icon. We'll unmute you and you can ask your question live. The chat box will also be available today. There'll be a lot of helpful resources and links from the presentations today that will be submitted there. So please keep an eye on those. And you can also use the chat box at the end to ask your questions. If at any point today you need to adjust your audio settings, you can do so by clicking the audio setting tab in the bottom left and adjust your settings as needed. If at any point you need to adjust your viewing settings today, you can do so by clicking that viewing options tab in the upper middle and adjust your settings there. You can also click the 4 arrows in the top right to enter and exit full screen mode if you need to. And I believe that covers all of that. So now I will introduce our moderator today for Joe Hines. Joe is the Senior Principal and Director of Economic Development for Timmons Group. In his tenure, the economic development practice has helped their clients realize over $16 billion in announced investment with over 16,000 jobs created by national and international companies. Joe and Timmons Group were an integral part of the original offshore wind studies completed by Virginia Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy and North Carolina Department of Commerce that helped frame up the offshore wind opportunity for both states. Joe is a licensed professional engineer and holds a bachelor's in civil engineering from NC State and an MBA from Duke's Fuqua School of Business. Joe, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks so much, Trey, for that kind introduction, and thanks everyone for taking the time to join us today for this obviously exciting opportunity and topic, offshore wind, setting the stage. I think it is a little bit fortuitous that we're kicking this webinar series off during National Engineers Week, as we're harnessing the offshore wind to provide electricity on shore, which is definitely an engineering marvel within itself. Before I introduce the speakers, I'd like to provide some context as to how we got to this point. Next slide, Trey. So, in looking at the East Coast offshore wind energy opportunities, we had to first look at the context of, what can we determine is the total wind energy potential out there. And for the engineers in the room, we deal a lot with potential and applied physics in what we do. But the wind energy is one of those elements that we have to look at very closely. Part of that evaluation was done, and it was determined that there were several potential lease areas off the East Coast that could be hosting to a very successful wind farm or a translation of energy back to the East Coast. And essentially, these lease areas were set up by BOEM, that's Bureau Ocean of Energy Management. And then they've gone through a significant process to get to the point where they weren't going to interfere with military operations in terms of military operations off the coast, training and whatnot. And so we were able to determine those lease areas to get to the point where we could actually start building windmills out in the actual ocean to harness this energy. Next slide. So part of the previous studies that we had worked with our speakers on, Timmons Group was part of the team with BVG Associates that led the series of studies in Virginia with Department of Mines, Mineral and Energy, or DMME, that started in 2015, and we had two different sets of reports and updates from 2015 and 2018 to look at the opportunity. Had several discussions with Virginia Port Authority about the infrastructure assets, which we'll cover in the second webinar series as well. And then we transitioned to North Carolina and did a study in 2020 with BVG and the associated team with NC State Clean Energy Tech Center, NC State Economic Development, Lloyd's Register, and BVG, looking at the supply chain opportunities. So how can we actually capitalize on this market and expand that opportunity for both Virginia and North Carolina? Next slide. So that led to the ultimate agreement for the Smart Power Agreement between Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. What we realized as part of these studies within the context of the East Coast is there were going to be a couple of spots where it was going to make sense to stage for the offshore wind energy. When we looked at Virginia's port assets relative to their ability to get product out to the sea, they have the ability to do it without any aerial bridges that would create a problem for moving product on Jones Act vessel out. But essentially that led to the creation of the opportunity for Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina to work together to capitalize on this. North Carolina's strengths that we discovered were the supply chain, advanced manufacturing capacities, and Virginia's strengths were essentially having the port assets to be able to move forward. So Smart Power stands for Southeast and Mid-Atlantic Regional Transformative Partnership for Offshore Wind Energy Resources. All right. So now I'd like to go ahead, you can go back to that last slide, or you can leave that slide up if you want to. Trey, now I'd like to introduce our speakers. I've personally had the privilege of working with all three professionals you're going to hear from today on the original studies that we completed, which I just talked to you about, that helped frame up this opportunity for both Virginia and North Carolina. Our first speaker is going to be Jennifer Mont. In 2022, Jennifer Mont joined the North Carolina Department of Commerce as the Assistant Secretary for Clean Energy Economic Development, a new role in the department. She will lead the efforts to secure clean energy, economic, and workforce opportunities for North Carolina, including offshore wind. Jennifer brings more than 15 years of state service to commerce. Most recently, she served as a senior policy advisor in the Department of Environmental Quality. And prior to that, Jennifer worked for more than a decade as a nonpartisan senior legislative analyst for the North Carolina General Assembly. Our next speaker will be Dr. John Hardin. Dr. Hardin is the executive director of the North Carolina Board of Science, Technology, and Innovation, which is appropriate for the offshore wind energy to have been evaluated by them in the first place. This is staffed by the Office of Science, Technology, and Innovation, North Carolina Department of Commerce. He was appointed acting director in spring of 2008 and then executive director in fall of 2009. From 2003 to 2008, he served as the board's deputy director and chief policy analyst. And last but not least, we'll hear from Al Christopher. Al is director of the Energy Division, a part of the Virginia Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy, or we call it DMME, that is tasked to enhance the development and conservation of energy and mineral resources in a safe, environmentally sound manner to support a more productive economy. I have to admit, Al has one of the most fascinating backgrounds of anyone I've worked with in this profession. Prior to joining DMME in 2009, Al was a newspaper editor and reporter for 14 years, and that was from 1975 to 1989, working in Hampton, Virginia, Tampa, Florida, and Washington, D.C. From 1989 to 2007, he was a second-generation fuel distributor, and from 2006 to 2009, he was executive director of Virginia Clean Cities, a nonprofit coalition supported and funded by stakeholder members and the federal and state departments of energy. Jennifer, we look forward to your comments starting off, and then John and Al, your comments as well. I'll hand it over to Jennifer. Thank you.
Wonderful. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Joe. Screen is coming up. get it in presentation mode. I just want to say thanks everybody for the opportunity to share this information with y'all. My colleague John and I will be available at the end of the presentation to answer any questions that y'all might have. And we'll just get going. John, if you would hit the next slide, please. Thank you. This is just a quick overview of what John and I will present over the next 20 or so minutes about North Carolina's experience and where we're going next with offshore wind. I'll start off with a quick discussion of the federal state approach to offshore wind and the process under which we all follow to engage. I'll talk about our wind energy areas, the status of each, and the next steps that I foresee, as well as some of our state policies as they pertain to offshore wind. At that point, I'll shift it over and hand the mic over to John, and he'll discuss economic opportunities, a cost-benefit analysis that has been recently conducted, and then, like I said, we'll be available at the very end to answer any questions. Next slide, please, John. So I thought, would you hit it one more time? There you go. Thank you. I would note that, first of all, and Joe mentioned this at the top of his comments, that the work that's done to identify these wind energy areas off of our coast is a collaborative process that involves both the states as well as the Federal Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is an agency within the Department of the Interior. Under federal law, the Federal Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or as I like to refer to them as BOEM, is responsible for ensuring that activities that take place on the outer continental shelf, which are identified as areas off the Atlantic coast that are more than 3 nautical miles seaward and beyond, that those activities are conducted in a safe and environmentally sound manner. In order to achieve this, BOEM works collaboratively with the states that are adjacent to those proposed activities through the work of what are referred to as renewable energy task forces. The goal of those task forces is to coordinate with the affected states, local, and tribal governments, as well as the analog federal agencies, when BOEM moves to take any leasing, easement, or right-of-way types of actions that might affect those state, local, or tribal governments in those adjacent lands. Using a forum such as a task force, BOEM is able to share any current and innovative information that it has about those leasing activities, and where the state, local, and tribal officials can provide meaningful and timely input to help inform BOEM's activities as it moves the process forward. Working in a task force environment can help promote efficient and effective communication, provide for disseminating information in that timely and consistent fashion, and then providing that information to all parties at the same time, and allow those parties an opportunity to share their input and be informed by the process rather than react to BOEM's actions after the fact. BOEM convened the first North Carolina Renewable Energy Task Force back in 2011 to engage in a thorough review of the state's areas off our coast for potential offshore wind energy area leasing. The task force met a half dozen times from 2011 through 2016 and identified 3 areas for potential development: the Kitty Hawk wind energy area to the north, and the Wilmington East and Wilmington West areas to the south. And those are noted on that map that is on the right of your slide. And I would just like to take a moment to note that in 2018, BOEM shifted into a regional approach to the work of its task forces, recognizing that each of the areas that it had identified off the coast were very close in proximity to a neighboring state. And if you look at that map, that's pretty apparent when you look at the Kitty Hawk area as well as the Wilmington areas. They're both very close to our neighbors to the north and south. And so in 2018, BOEM shifted to this regional approach, and North Carolina is now part of 3 regional task forces. The first is the Virginia-North Carolina Task Force, and it's in that task force that work on the Kitty Hawk project and meetings take place. There's the Carolina Long Bay Task Force that we share with our our friends down in South Carolina, and that's the venue through which we meet and discuss on the Wilmington areas. And then there's a new task force, which I'll talk about in a few slides, dubbed the Central Atlantic Task Force, which is developing right now potential opportunities for new wind energy areas through its work from about Hatteras Island north all the way to the northern border of the state of Delaware. Next slide, please. So in terms of current status, where are we with these various wind energy areas? And the picture that's up right now is indicative of the winnowing and review process that BOEM goes through to identify these areas, and the thorough work that is done to deconflict, if you will, to make sure that there aren't conflicts with other ocean users. And so that red outline that you see on that picture on the right is indicative of the original planning area or draft call area that BOEM put out. And the orange highlighted section in the top right of the slide represents the area that was ultimately leased in 2017 to Avangrid Renewables when they won an auction for that 200-odd square mile area that's dubbed the Kitty Hawk Wind Energy Area. If you would just hit the button, I think a new picture will come up. Thank you. Since March of 2017, when they won the lease, Avangrid Renewables has completed a site assessment, which involved the deploying of ocean buoys to learn more about the area, including much more detailed meteorological data. Avangrid has also submitted its construction and operations plan for the western portion of the area, which is denoted in that pink shaded portion of that polygon. And Avangrid is now working with BOEM to prepare its draft environmental impact statement for that construction and operations plan. In the construction operations plan, or what's referred to as a COP, Kitty Hawk proposes the construction and operation of up to 69 wind turbine generators, 1 offshore substation, inter-array cables, 1 onshore substation, and up to 2 export cables that would land in Sandbridge Beach in Virginia, and then ultimately connect to the onshore electric grid. The COP for the eastern, or the remaining white portion of that polygon, is still under development and will go through the same completeness review by BOEM and then a follow-on NEPA or environmental evaluation. It's estimated that once the full area is fully built out, constructed, and installed, the project is estimated to generate 2.5 gigawatts of energy, which can power roughly 700,000 homes. Next slide, please. Moving south to Wilmington East, this is a project that is currently on track and in progress right now. BOEM is on target to lease this 130,000 odd acre wind energy area by midsummer this year. Late last year, BOEM published what's known as a proposed sale notice and a draft supplemental environmental assessment, and received comments on both documents in early January of this year. Presently, BOEM is reviewing those comments and considering and incorporating the content of those comments as it prepares a final sale notice, which will be published, I anticipate, sometime next month. And in that final sale notice, there'll be a description of the final contours of that area for potential lease, whether BOEM will decide to subdivide that larger green polygon into separate areas for multiple leases in the coming auction, as well as identify other stipulations and criteria that potential bidders will need to be mindful and aware of prior to the auction. Like I said, I anticipate that BOEM will release that final sale notice, as well as a record of decision for the draft supplemental environmental assessment sometime in March. I anticipate that they would hold a lease auction in May and then execute the lease or leases if they're more than one area within that polygon leased on or by June 30th of this year. According to Boehm estimates, that when built out, this full polygon area could generate at least 1.5 gigawatts of energy, which could power up to 500,000 North Carolina homes. Next slide, please. I mentioned before that there's this new task force that's underway to identify additional lease areas off of the Atlantic. There's a lot of potential out there, especially as the industry has taken some great strides towards developing and installing floating wind technology, which is driven towards much more deeper waters. But what I would note is that at several coastal states' request for additional lease areas, and in also keeping with the federal administration's goal of deploying at least 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, Boehm began its leasing process and convened its first meeting of this new Central Atlantic Intergovernmental Renewable Energy Task Force just this time last week. This task force is serving as a forum to discuss and share information that's related to the planning and leasing process of potential areas, like I said, from the Delaware coast all the way down to Cape Hatteras. Boehm set out the map that you see here as quote unquote draft planning areas. And after considering several known conflicts in the area, and heard feedback from various federal, state, and tribal governments, and then met with several stakeholders through early engagement meetings. These meetings were attended by more than 400 individuals and included representatives from the maritime industries, commercial and recreational fisheries, environmental non-governmental organizations, and the wind energy industry at large. Based on the feedback that Boehm received from all of those stakeholders at the start, Boehm released a draft call for information, and a nomination area was published. And if you would just hit the slide, you'll see the results of that were provided here. This draft call for information and potential nominations area for new wind energy areas comprises a 31% reduction in the original plan that Boehm had released later last year. And these 6 polygons that are identified here were the subject of pretty robust, thorough discussion during last week's Central Atlantic Task Force meeting. The next steps that are identified for that are included there on the slide. I won't go through, I won't take the time to read those to you, but it's Boehm's goal, according to their timelines that they set out, to lease any areas that are identified off the Central Atlantic coast by mid-2023. Next slide, please. So I would just note that while this is a federal and state collaborative process to advance offshore wind, North Carolina has been mobilizing to take advantage of the offshore wind opportunity throughout the whole of Governor Cooper's administration. In October of 2018, he signed Executive Order 80, which set the course for North Carolina's commitment to address climate change and transition our state to a clean energy economy. There was a directive in EO 80 to the Department of Environmental Quality to create a clean energy plan, and that was published in 2019. Within the clean energy plan, there were 3 discrete recommendations that were focused on offshore wind, among the dozens of other recommendations that covered the whole ecosystem of clean energy. One of those recommendations, and Joe mentioned this at the top, was to create and foster regional relationships and regional partnerships so that we could cooperatively develop, robust offshore wind industry in an energy market. This was accomplished when Governors Cooper, Hogan, and Northam from Maryland and Virginia joined together to sign the MOU for Smart Power that Joe referenced earlier. And then last year, if you would hit the next button, please. 2018 was a banner year for clean energy and for offshore wind in particular. In October, Governor Cooper signed into law the Bipartisan Energy Solutions for North Carolina legislation putting North Carolina on a path to a carbon-free electric power sector by 2050. And then in June of last year, Governor Cooper signed Executive Order 218, which is advancing North Carolina's economic clean energy future with offshore wind. EO 218 addressed one of the other recommendations that came out of the Clean Energy Plan from 2019. EO 218 sets out the first executive action related to offshore wind and sets out development goals for the first time for North Carolina. 2.8 gigawatts developed off our coast by 2030 and 8 gigawatts developed off our coast by 2040. It also establishes NC Towers Task Force, which is the North Carolina Task Force for Offshore Wind Economic Resource Strategies. The membership of this task force is made up of 30 individuals who represent a variety of perspectives and affiliations. The task force held its inaugural meeting 2 weeks ago, and we're apprised that we're going to be subdividing the group into 4 subcommittees so that we can dive deeper into items that are under its charge. The executive order also directed several agencies within the Cooper administration to identify offshore wind or clean energy leads. And then lastly, the EO codified the ongoing work of the Offshore Wind Interagency Work Group, which is comprised of a team of leaders from the Departments of Commerce, Environmental Quality, Transportation, our Department of Military and Veterans Affairs, the State Ports Authority, that's convened by the governor's office to address and to identify cross-cutting offshore wind topics and issues. Next slide, please. So we are well on our way towards meeting that 8 gigawatt goal. If you see on the left side of the slide, right now we have 2 wind energy areas that in total, once fully built out, will have 4 gigawatts of development off our coast. And that's going to be somewhere close to 2030 or so. We'll be well ahead of the 2.8 goal by 2030. How do we get to gigawatts? Well, that involves a lot of our efforts with this new Central Atlantic Task Force. If you'd hit the advance. Our goals for the Central Atlantic Task Force going forward are to ensure that we have a transparent and open process with all the stakeholders. We are committed to using data-driven information and science to help make the decisions that are required to fully analyze any areas that could be considered for offshore wind development. North Carolina is committed to working with BOEM and all the federal partners, including the DoD, all ocean users, and working so that we can protect any environmental and other natural resources from any activities that are pursued. And we believe that with transparent process, we can help identify developable areas off of our coast that are large enough to support that additional 4 gigawatts of energy generation needed to meet our 8 gigawatt goal by 2040. And with that, I'm really pleased to transition over to John Hardin, who will share, we'll give you all a good teaser about where we are with our economic opportunities that are built into offshore wind. So thank you all for your time.
All right, thanks, Jennifer. So I'm going to step back a little bit and broaden the aperture a little bit and focus on an opportunity for North Carolina, but that opportunity involves activity outside of North Carolina as well. So offshore wind is a large opportunity for North Carolina and at least three different dimensions. Number one, it can mean billions of dollars in economic development. And I have some data to back that up in a slide later on. It can mean thousands of new jobs for North Carolinians and also a significant increase in renewable energy generation. So offshore wind has the potential to be beneficial for the economy, for the environment, and for the energy sector. And the reason that opportunity is so large is because in addition to the activity off of North Carolina that Jennifer just talked about, and as Joe talked about, there's a significant amount of opportunity up and down the entire East Coast. And as you can see in those peach-colored areas outside in the ocean. And those will all be built out in the coming years. And North Carolina has the potential and a strong potential actually to generate many of the parts and components, the thousands of parts and components that go into the turbines and the cabling and everything associated with these offshore wind farms. So if you look at the states up and down the East Coast, you can see that they are shaded green, and you can see that North Carolina is shaded the darkest green. And that's because North Carolina has the largest share of its GDP that comes from manufacturing, a larger share than any other state on the East Coast. So essentially, North Carolina is the strongest manufacturing state on the East Coast, and it's the fifth strongest manufacturing state in the entire United States. And so it has a long and rich tradition of manufacturing, and the opportunities for existing companies in North Carolina to expand to this new opportunity in offshore wind to essentially pivot their operations is significant. We also have a significant opportunity to recruit new companies, either from other states or from other countries. One thing that I think might have been noted earlier is that offshore wind has been a significant industry in Europe for more than 30 years now. And so North Carolina and the United States have the benefit of learning from their lessons learned and piggybacking on their hard work and ramping up much faster in the US. And we expect that a large number of companies in Europe will want to form joint partnerships with manufacturing companies in North Carolina, and will also eventually set up shop in North Carolina. And so we want to pursue that in several different ways. So there's the entire opportunity. And then in terms of the offshore wind development, if you add up all of the state-driven targets, Jennifer talked about the targets in North Carolina, all the other states have targets too. If you add those up, they essentially add up to 40 gigawatts, which is a considerable amount of energy generation, hundreds, if not thousands of turbines, and a significant economic opportunity. About 20 gigawatts are actually for active projects that are in the procurement phase. So these are ready to go. They're not operational yet. They haven't been developed yet, but they are at the starting line. And as Jennifer noted, 1 gigawatt of power, of offshore wind power, powers about 380,000 homes per year. And to put that in perspective, many of you know that there's a nuclear power plant outside of Raleigh, the Sharon Harris nuclear power plant, and that generates about a gigawatt of power. And so you can assume that if we've got 40 gigawatts up and down the East Coast of the US, there's essentially the equivalent of 40 nuclear power plants along those of that size up and down the East Coast. That's a significant amount of power that will be clean energy and also promote economic development. So this is a really detailed set of charts, and I won't go through this in a lot of detail, but there's really 3 charts going on. And so the first chart on the left is all the executed offtake agreements. These are the ones that are essentially on the starting line and ready to go. You can see that most of those are in the northeastern states, New York, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey. And that's because offshore wind, when it is kind of migrated over from Europe, started in the Northeast, but is really coming down the East Coast now. And so North Carolina is right there in the next group. And so if you add up all of these executed offtake agreements up and down the East Coast, they add up to 14,000 megawatts or 14 gigawatts of power. And that's all in that left chart. If you move to the chart in the upper right, those are in the next stage. Those are committed offtake agreements. And as you can see, those are all in Virginia. And those are the developer for those is Dominion Energy. And Virginia actually is the only state in the nation that has 2 offshore wind, or actually has offshore wind turbines in federal waters at the moment. There's 2 of them, and they are demonstration turbines. And soon Virginia will be developing a full-scale wind farm in 3 tranches that you see there. There are other turbines off the coast of the US. Those are in state waters, and those are off the coast of Rhode Island. In total, there are 7, but in the coming years, there will be hundreds, if not thousands, of turbines again. Then finally, that last table on the right those are the ones, the projects that are in the pipeline that are progressing well, a little behind the others, but catching up fast. Those 2 are the Kitty Hawk project that's developed by Avangrid Renewables And you can see the dates when those will be coming online, 2026 and 2027, which will be here before we know it. If you add up all of the megawatts across all of those, that adds up to 20 megawatts of power. So there's 20 gigawatts of active projects in the procurement phase. That'll be 13 turbines and foundations and 25 substations and foundations. So there's a significant amount of hardware involved in these wind farms. So as Jennifer noted, North Carolina has had this on our radar, offshore wind, for quite a while, but it wasn't until recently that we really began to dig into the details. And one of the ways we did that, coming on the heels of the Clean Energy Plan, was we combined some funding from the Department of Environmental Quality and the Department of Commerce in North Carolina to hire a set of consultants to help us address these questions, to really dig in and say, what is really the size of the economic opportunity related to offshore wind for North Carolina? What are North Carolina's advantages? What are our existing assets, our business potential, our infrastructure? For example, we have 2 state ports, as you'll see in a minute, and inland ports as well. How do all those play into the opportunity? And then what do we need to do? What are some options, some recommendations we can pursue to support the growth and the development of offshore wind? We know it's going to happen anyway, but it's going to happen a lot faster and probably in a better fashion if we're proactive and do our homework before all that gets going. So we put out a request for proposals almost 2 years ago now. This went out internationally, and we said, we're looking for experts to answer these questions. We got almost 20 proposals back. We had a competitive review process, and at the end of the day, selected the team that you see here. This was led by BVG Associates, which is a firm, consulting firm, offshore wind firm based in the UK, which is the key location for offshore wind currently. And they assembled a team that consisted also of Lloyd's Register, also from the UK, Timmons Group, represented today by Joe Hines, and then 2 organizations from North Carolina State University. They have a whole workforce development group. Then they have a special center there called the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center that is an expert in clean energy and helped with the whole assessment process. So this team worked for about 6 months in the fall of 2021, or actually 2020, and time flies. It was fall of 2020, and they produced this report, which was released in March of 2021. And it's about 130 pages long, I think, but it's actually a very interesting read because it's built to be read by people who are not experts in offshore wind. It's very readable. If you don't know anything about offshore wind, I would highly recommend that you read this because it gives you a good sense of where the industry started, where it's headed, what the opportunities are, and then it really digs down into what North Carolina's opportunities are. Scattered throughout the report are 48 specific recommendations. We're not going to cover those recommendations today, but those are some of the things that NC Towers task force that Jennifer talked about is beginning to consider the best ways to implement those recommendations. If you're interested in seeing this report, it is available on the North Carolina Department of Commerce's website. All you need to do is go to nccommerce.com. There's a search engine at the top of the webpage and just type in offshore wind, and you will be linked to this page where the report is. You'll also see a link to the NC Towers task force, so you can see all the members there, what the first agenda was, and some other information associated with that task force. So a key reason that North Carolina is so interested in this opportunity, in addition to the opportunity off the coast, is you can see from this picture how big these components are. This is the nacelle, which is where the power is generated. The actual blades go into that rotor that you see on the right, and you can see how big it is. And there are literally thousands of parts that go into this nacelle. And I've heard different numbers, but the number I've heard the most is somewhere around 8,000. And those 8,000 parts need to be made somewhere. And we think North Carolina is a great location for those parts to be manufactured. And most of those parts can be manufactured anywhere. So they don't have to be manufactured close to the shore, although there are some components that are best manufactured and can only be manufactured close to the shore. But there's an economic opportunity across the state for virtually all the parts that go into this nacelle. And as noted earlier, North Carolina has a long history and a strong foundation in manufacturing. So we're really well positioned to lead these activities. This gives you a sense of how big a blade is, and these blades are getting bigger every year. That's essentially the length of a football field. And some of these components, like the blades and the actual final assembly of the nacelle, and perhaps the towers as well, the foundations on which these nacelles sit, those do need to be manufactured close to the shore. They're just simply too big to be driven down the interstate and or put on a train. Certainly can't be flown, and so those do need to be manufactured close to the shore, typically close to a port, so that they can easily be positioned for staging and then to be shipped out to be constructed into the offshore wind farms. So this gives you a sense of all the different kind of components. And this is just a high level view. Of course, there are sub-views which are much more specific that go into an offshore wind farm. And if you start at the very top, you can see that a portion of that is just simply the assessment work that's needed to do the homework before construction ever begins. But then there's a whole section moving from 12 o'clock down to about 4 o'clock that relates to the turbine. You've got the blades, you've got the castings and forgings, the drivetrain, the tower, the turbine, all of that. And all that's an opportunity to be manufactured in North Carolina. Then if you move down to the green area, the balance of plant, you've got subsea export cables. And it's important to note that, that there's actually a company in North Carolina that is actually manufacturing the cables that will be used in the wind farm that's going to be off the coast of Massachusetts. And so North Carolina is already serving that opportunity. Then you can see in the blue, there is a lot of significant work with respect to installation. And I should note that everything essentially from the 6 o'clock mark all the way up to the 12 o'clock mark, the area that's in blue as well as purple, all that has a very significant local component to it, because that has to do with installation and operations and maintenance, and everything in purple is ongoing for the life of a wind farm. And a wind farm typically lasts for about 30 years. So this is long-term employment and long-term manufacturing as well. I just received a note that we may need to catch up on time, so I'm going to go a little bit faster. And as you can see, this, if you look at the color scheme there and translate that to this is just another way of looking at it. This is basically saying, okay, all those different stages that were in that pie chart are up there at the top, the blades, the drivetrain, the tower, those are the different components. And then what you see below in the left-hand column is the number of gigawatts associated with all the projects on the various states. So you start with Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, and go all the way down to North Carolina. Everything that's within that large red circle is the total addressable market for North Carolina. And that essentially adds up to $165 billion, which is a large opportunity. Now, realistically, North Carolina is more likely to go after some of that and realize some of that than others. So the green area, everything within the green circle, all that are the various components that need to be manufactured, and North Carolina has a good chance of going after a good portion of that. The portion that's down in purple on the kind of lower right is the component that is much more, has a local component to it. So that's the area that involves the installation and the operations and maintenance. So everything off the coast of Virginia, North Carolina, and Maryland, that's all close enough to our ports to be addressable by North Carolina. Everything above there that is in white is probably too distant to be serviced from North Carolina. So within that entire red circle, the area that's in green as well as the area that's in purple, that's really addressable by North Carolina. And that adds up to about $100 billion over the lifetime of these wind farms. So quickly, I should note that North Carolina is already trying to capitalize on this opportunity on the Department of Commerce's website. We have a supply chain directory where companies around the world can enter their information if they are interested in being involved in the supply chain for North Carolina, the offshore wind supply chain. We already have 90 firms that are signed up, and you can see that those firms are of all different types: manufacturers, construction, legal services, marine services, and so forth. You can also see that a lot of occupations are involved in the entire supply chain for offshore wind. A good portion of it, the largest portion, has to do with production, and that's manufacturing primarily. Another 20% is in installation and maintenance. A lot of that has a strong local component to it. But then if you go around on the pie chart, you can see there's a whole array of industries and occupations that are involved in this. And that's really good, because that means that's going to build out a whole ecosystem of workforce as well as industries that can be involved in this sector that will be growing over the next decade or two. North Carolina is really well positioned when it comes to its infrastructure. Won't go into detail here, but you can see that given our strengths in manufacturing, we can maximize that because we have a really strong transportation system, road system, rail system, and we're ready to support this first wave of projects that will be coming on in the next few years. We have two state-operated ports, the Port of Morehead City, which is centrally located up and down in North Carolina, and then we have the Port of Wilmington. The consultants who worked on that supply chain report did a pretty deep dive in assessing these ports to determine whether they really would be feasible to serve this industry. And the short answer is yes, they are. They're well positioned both geographically as well as where they're located, water depths, all of that. They're not perfect. There are no perfect ports in the US. All of them need some upgrades in order to serve this. But if they compared our ports to probably a dozen other ports up and down the East Coast, and ours ranked very high. And so we need to do what we can to take advantage of our ports to serve this opportunity. Finally, the last thing I'll talk about is people want to know, well, exactly what will this mean in terms of economic benefit? And there's a couple of different ways we can break that down. The first way is what I've already conveyed, and that is, in a general sense, to serve the entire East Coast, what would the opportunity be? And then more specifically, what's the economic opportunity associated with, say, a single offshore wind farm or an offshore wind project? So there's an organization based in North Carolina, but it serves the entire southeastern US, called the Southeastern Wind Coalition. And they teamed up with E2, which is an environmental group, an energy group, and they did a pretty deep dive and assessment. And there is actually software out there developed by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory called JEDI, Jobs and Economic Development Investment, I think. I can't remember what JEDI stands for, but that's close. Very sophisticated modeling, and the modeling software is very similar to the software that the North Carolina Department of Commerce uses for all of its economic development projects. So it's very well informed by industry data. It's a lot of economists have worked on this, energy experts. A lot of inputs go into it as far as what the various cost of these various components would be. And it's an input-output model. You put in a bunch of inputs and out comes economic impact estimates. And when the Southeastern Wind Coalition did these estimates, they actually estimated two scenarios, both of these with a wind farm coming on in the year of 2030. The base scenario used kind of baseline estimates that depended on pretty heavily on that assessment that I talked about earlier. And it's kind of conservative estimates, but then they also had a high scenario, which is a much more optimistic estimate, where essentially 100% of the blades and offshore substations would be manufactured in North Carolina. Either way you do it, whether it's the base scenario or the high scenario, you can see that just for a single project, the net economic impact is large. It's in the billions, either 3 billion or 4 billion, and this is over a number of years. And the jobs over a number of years are also significant. 20 on the base scenario, it's 27,000. And again, these are jobs years. So if you have a job that lasts for a year, that's one job year. If that same job lasts 5 years, that would be 5 job years, and that's what job years means. You can see that the number of job years is very large for the construction phase, and that's a shorter phase. That's typically 2 years to 6 years to build out an entire wind farm of this size. But then on an ongoing basis, on an annual basis for almost up to 30 years, you have probably close to 1,000 jobs just to keep the wind farms going. And this is just a single wind farm. So if you'd like more information about this, you can just go to the Southeastern Wind Coalition's website. You can read the full report, which is about 40 pages long, and all their methodology and their assumptions and inputs are transparent and easy to see. And that wraps up our presentation, and we'd be happy to take questions later on.
Thank you, John. And now, Al, we'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Trey and Joe, for the introduction. Thanks to Jennifer and John for a great overview of the big picture, the BOEM relationship with the states, and an impressive overview of what North Carolina has done to date and expects to do going forward. And Trey, can you open my slides, please? All right, thank you. So I want to also thank NC East Alliance, Timmons Group, and the Hampton Roads Alliance for putting this webinar series together. I'm the director of renewable energy and energy efficiency programs at the Virginia Department of Energy. We recently changed our name from the Virginia Department of Mines, Minerals and Energy to a shorter version, Virginia Energy. We still do all of the same things we were doing before. We regulate and inspect and the mines, mineral mining, coal mining, oil and gas. We have a geology and mineral resources section. And under my section, most of the renewable energy and energy efficiency reside with a staff across the state, mostly in Richmond, but distributed elsewhere as well. And I am acting here in an interim role as the offshore wind program manager. And by the way, we are now advertising for that position, director of the offshore wind program at the Department of Energy in Virginia. And my contact information on the last slide and some of the web links on the last slide can help you find that if you're interested or know someone who would be interested in applying for that position. Next slide, please. So just to set the stage for a little background, all of this has been mentioned. This is a close-up view of both the research lease, those blue blocks on the left of that large yellow square, and that's the site of this agency's research lease, the only offshore research lease for renewable energy awarded by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. That lease site now is the home to the CVOW pilot. The CVOW means Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind. And that's the name of both the pilot project and the commercial project, which is underway. The pre-construction phases are underway in that large yellow area, the wind energy area that was leased by Dominion Energy Virginia in a competitive process run by BOEM. The pilot is currently home to a 2-turbine, 12 megawatt pilot project, which is a precursor to the full-scale build-out of the 113,000 acre wind energy area, which is about 23.5 nautical miles offshore from the Virginia Beach coastline. The federal lease for that larger wind energy area was executed in November of 2013 in a competitive lease process that included, I believe, about a half dozen bidders. It was the second lease auction of federal waters on the East Coast. The interest has grown with every lease offering since then. So now a much larger number of interested parties is likely to apply for these next leases. If you could go to the next slide, please. And this is just to give some scale comparisons for the CVOW pilot has 6 megawatt turbines, and that's the smaller turbine immediately adjacent to the Washington Monument there. And the second development, the commercial development, those are expected to be that size. Those are the larger 12 megawatt turbines that are planned for the development of that wind energy area. The initial expectation for the amount of energy capacity that could be placed on that lease was about 2,000 megawatts. Because of improved technology and larger turbines, you can see that already has exceeded Dominion Energy's plan for development in 3 phases that was mentioned earlier in Jennifer and John's presentation. Includes 880 watt phases, or a total of 2,640 megawatts in total. The policies that enable this to move forward include the Virginia Clean Energy Act, which was signed into law in 2020. And it starts much earlier than that as well. The beginning of energy policy and research Virginia began in 2007 with the founding of the Virginia Coastal Energy Research Consortium of VCERC. That was created as an interdisciplinary study, research, and information resource for the Commonwealth on coastal energy potential. And it provided the research and development required for the commercialization and implementation of renewable energy, both offshore wind and wave resources. Then in 2010, the Commonwealth's commitment to offshore wind grew with the creation of the Virginia Offshore Wind Development Authority, VOWDA. VOWDA was created for purposes of facilitating, coordinating, and supporting the development of the offshore wind energy industry projects and the associated supply chain opportunity. I mentioned earlier that the more recent legislation, which passed in 2018, further expanded the offshore wind industry and development commitment in the state, wherein the legislators deemed 5,200 megawatts of offshore wind resources to be in the public interest. Next slide, please. I know that all of us here, just from hearing the presentation from North Carolina, had a very exciting and busy year in 2021. We certainly did in Virginia, and I expect that will continue and accelerate in 2022 and beyond. In the next few slides, I'll recount some of the more memorable milestones recently. I'll let you read them for yourselves. I'll mention only a few. And I believe I saw in the chat that the NC East Alliance will be posting all the slides. Next slide, please. The three of the milestones in no particular order fit into the category of making the vision of steel in the water real. And there is a rendition of the Portsmouth Marine Terminal, one of the Port of Virginia properties that is now fully leased for offshore wind purposes. You can see for yourself, who are leasing and which the size of those spaces. And as John mentioned, some work will be needed to fully prepare the property for the primarily for the load, the ground load, but that is underway and budgeted to be accomplished where it's needed, and any other improvements that will be needed to make sure that that is a base camp for offshore wind to serve Virginia and the region. Next slide, please. And that what you saw depicted there included Siemens Gamesa Renewable Energy's footprint for the first offshore wind turbine blade finishing facility in the United States. That is one of the larger leasers, and Dominion Energy leased 72 acres there for staging and pre-assembly for foundations and turbine components. And then one of the significant milestones was when the U.S. Interior Secretary Haaland announced that BOEM would initiate environmental review for Dominion's CVOW commercial project. And that was the first major milestone in the federal permitting of that 2.6 gigawatt project. Next slide, please. So there, that is a depiction of the Charybdis. That is the US flagged turbine installation vessel commissioned by Dominion and its partners. That's now under construction in Brownsville, Texas. You can see in the slide what it would look like if it were operating today. It should be ready to operate by the fourth quarter of 2023. And before it gets to the Virginia project that Dominion is building, Ørsted and Eversource have chartered the vessel for the construction of the Revolution Wind and Sunrise Wind off of Rhode Island. Excuse me, next slide, please. And here are, again, some examples of key milestones involving the supply chain, and a little bit on the workforce training and integrating offshore wind power generation into what is only a partially prepared electric grid. The latest phase of funding for harbor deepening and widening was announced 2 months ago. And that is key to completing the inner harbor dredging project in 2024, which will make Virginia the deepest harbor on the East Coast. The next and last slide has my contact information and some links to offshore wind pages on Virginia Energy's website. I didn't mention some other important parts of the program in Virginia because they were well covered by my colleagues in North Carolina. The Smart Power MOU with Maryland, North Carolina, and Virginia is obviously an ongoing and important initiative to help develop an effective supply chain for this region. I will mention that we are engaging now. We have been engaged briefly, and this will be a long-term commitment with PJM, the ISO that includes Virginia and a small part of North Carolina and other states to our north and west. While they are looking at transmission upgrades that will be required for distributed energy resources and for offshore wind. And it's going to be very important over the next year or so for states to collaborate and work regionally on ways to reduce the cost and find the best and lowest cost solution for modernizing the grid, which is not necessitated by offshore wind, but by widespread expansion in the use of renewable energy generation for utility scale power production in the country. There are also some links to some of the workforce development pieces that we have put together in Virginia or participated regionally to create. And I won't go into those at this point in the interest of time. I believe we're getting near the point where we're going to move to Q&A.
Sure. Thank you, Al, for that presentation, as well as Jennifer and John. Trey, I'll default to you. Obviously, we're a little bit over our time, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time who got on today. Did you want to go ahead and do a couple minutes of Q&A, Trey?
Yeah, if anyone's interested in staying on for a couple more minutes, we can take one or two questions, and then to respect everyone's time, we'll close out the webinar.
Okay. And the other thing I'd like to emphasize is if you do have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to email Trey, and we'll try to get those answered for you as well. I know we had a couple of questions come in, and I guess one of them was, what year do we project there'll be enough critical mass for workboats offshore to have a manufacturing facility in the region? Would that be when Kenny Hawk finishes? John or Jennifer, I'm not sure if either one of you want to try to answer that question.
My short answer is I'm not certain, but I would say that it's likely to be the latter part of this decade.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. Another question we had come in pre-webinar was essentially, who does a potential supplier contact? Jennifer, you had put that up, as well as Matt, regarding the Virginia Offshore Wind Network chain directory. So I think that's available to everybody, and we can send that out with response to the link. Tom White just commented, excellent program. Thank you very much. So thank you, Tom. Tom was part of our integral part of our team representing NC State Economic Development. The other question that we received is, are there joint community college agreements or training programs for the offshore wind industry? And when is the best time for a person to pursue training for an offshore wind career? Al or John or Jennifer, have y'all looked into that aspect of it, or is that one of those things that we're going to be continuing to develop as we develop the strategy?
I can start on that, and just by pointing out that we do have the Mid-Atlantic Wind Alliance. And that's a training alliance dedicated to offering a full suite of wind-related training, including courses certified by the Global Wind Organization. There are training locations in Hampton Roads and Martinsville. The partners include the New College Institute, Mid-Atlantic Maritime Academy, Centura College, and Virginia Energy. And the entire community college system in Virginia, I believe there are about 21 campuses. They all include a number of great jobs related, training opportunities for offshore wind, from certificate programs all the way up to associate degrees. And if you want to start really young, Dominion Energy just announced a partnership with the National LEAD program for K-12 public schools. And they're accepting applications to receive grant funding that would include micro wind turbine installations and other hardware to help teachers present the opportunity there, both the science there and the opportunity to work in those fields.
If I might add to that, Al, thank you. And I'm a little jealous of what Virginia has in play already in terms of workforce training opportunities. But I think that we were supportive of an application by the Hampton Roads Alliance for the Economic Development Administration's Good Jobs Challenge, where a lot of efforts are being put forward for the Hampton Roads and Northeastern North Carolina opportunity with respect to offshore wind. And one of those components is to help stand up a program at the College of the Albemarle up in Northeastern North Carolina. That's one of our community college campuses that would be focused on workforce training in the offshore wind industry, ostensibly to support the Kitty Hawk installation, and then, or the Kitty Hawk installation, and then also the Virginia Sea Valve project. So we are right there with y'all, Al. Thank you.
All right, excellent. I think in the interest of time, that's probably all the questions we can afford to take on, but we will certainly be willing to entertain those questions and try to answer those as well too. So one, I'd like to thank Jennifer, John, and Al for providing an excellent overview of the opportunity that we have here. Obviously, this is an excellent multi-state opportunity. And I think, bringing the two states together has been just really a cool thing to see take place, because when we deal with economic development prospects, we know very clearly they do not look at state boundaries, nor they look at jurisdictional boundaries. They look at logistics boundaries and what their opportunities are within that. So I feel like, the two states working together is really going to create a lot of synergy moving forward. As far as North Carolina East is concerned and Hampton Roads Alliance, they've been working together for a number of years because there's access to certain assets, property, sites that would be beneficial to everybody. Again, I'd like to thank everybody who joined us today for your time today. Sorry we ran a few minutes over, but I think it was worthwhile, very much so. As mentioned, the next webinar will cover infrastructure assets, of which you saw a little bit of a preview on that today from John and Al and Jennifer. And then the third webinar will cover the supply chain opportunities. And as John mentioned, we're talking about $165 billion opportunity, and we want to try to capture as much of that as feasibly possible. But given the unique assets that both Virginia and North Carolina have, I feel very confident that we should be able to capture a significant amount of that opportunity. So please be on the lookout for those dates coming from Trey Goodson and NC East. And I hope everyone has a very happy National Engineers Week. I know that y'all probably came on this webinar not even thinking about that, but thank y'all for supporting the engineering profession, and we look forward to making this opportunity fulfill itself off the East Coast. Thank you very much for everybody's time.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.